Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special recording by Alex, that Steam guy. A couple of months ago, I was at the WITAN here in the UK and was lucky enough to speak concerning the current energy situation in the country. And a number of people since then have asked me to possibly re-record the speech so that they can come back to it and ask subsequent questions. Um, in the last couple of weeks, this has very much come into the back into people's minds. What with the chairman of Centrica complaining about the lack of gas storage and the lack of wind power that we've had recently. So I hope you enjoy this speech, which was originally recorded, as I say, for the WITAN back in August 2024. Power-assisted friend-enemy distinction. Friends, alas, such evil times should be ours. We stand at a crossroads in our island story. After a century of body blows, we now stand on the precipice, beyond which lies either the bright sunlit uplands of an Anglo-Renaissance or the abyss. Members of the WITAN, and indeed people listening on YouTube, we have to make the choice. Do we grasp this opportunity? Or do we turn away and spend what time we have been given to argue to what extent we're back or it's over on Twitter? Our history teaches us two crucial lessons upon which we can focus our efforts. Firstly, that new forms of wealth creation come from the control of new resources. And secondly, that wealth is ultimately upstream from power. The industrialists did not displace the aristocracy as the holders of power until they were richer than them. Dr. Parvini recently said that the USA was in the hands of a cabal of billionaires. Scrump and Evelyn hold that we're up against the money printer, and you can't scratch a libertarian without them beginning to foam at the mouth and complain about the Federal Reserve. And they're all quite right in their own ways. But further to these, we might also assert that in a post-subsistence economy, the control of energy supply controls the wealth creation process, and that the acquisition of political power is the final phase in the transition of elites, not the first. This means that any attempt to seize power in the political space is a complete waste of time. The cycling of elites resulting from an energy transition has historical precedent. In 1709, Abraham Darby III at Coalbrookdale in Shropshire discovered that it was possible to smelt iron with coke rather than charcoal. Then, in 1712, a Devonshire blacksmith by the name of Newcomen was able to successfully exploit the stored energy of coal to produce useful mechanical work. His atmospheric engine, so called because it used a vacuum rather than steam pressure as the primary motive force, only produced reciprocal motion and was used to pump water from mines. Taken together, they're widely regarded as key events in the early Industrial Revolution. Later, in 1765, the Scotsman James Watt famously improved on the atmospheric principle, first with the separate condenser, and then with the planetary gearing system, which allowed the engine to produce torque, a twisting force, necessary to drive machinery. At the same time, Arkwright of Derby was perfecting his water frame, so called because at that time it was powered by a water wheel, and inventing our modern understanding of the term factory. Indeed, the first of Watt's engines were installed at factories like Arkwright's to pump water from the bottom pond back up into the race during times of drought, so it could go back over the water wheel. Then the Cornishman Trevithick, working on Watt machines, developed the high-pressure steam engine to further drive economy, there being no coal reserves in his native Cornwall. This had the added benefit of reducing the size of engines to such an extent that they could make them locomotive to go up Camborne Hill coming down, as the famous song says. Experimenting further with his engine, he travelled to Shropshire, to the finest iron founders in the world, and built the world's first railway engine in 1802. Meanwhile, back up in Scotland, William Symington was busy on the Forth and Clyde Canal, putting steam to work on the water. These men and their funny little contraptions built from iron and exploiting the energy stored underground as coal, eventually drove our damp little island to global domination by creating wealth hitherto unimaginable. It was these men who opened the way for subsequent generations to usurp the hereditary aristocracy and claim their power. Thomas Ashton was a mill owner, a social reformer, and a close personal friend of Gladstone, from whom he refused a baronetcy. William Taylor Copeland came from the Staffordshire potteries to become the first or one of the Lord Mayors of London, whilst another who held the position, Sir John Kay, first baronet, was a wholesale stationer, and Sir Maurice Levy, also first baronet, came from a family of wholesale clothiers, Hart Levying Limited, which is still in business today. Both he and his brother were Liberal MPs. Sir Alfred Newton, first baronet, was variously a seed and grain broker, a yeast merchant in Burton-on-Trent, a chandler, a maritime salvage specialist, a shipping magnate, and a stockbroker before moving into public life, including indeed time as Lord Mayor of London. For the most part, these were not men of high idealism, but they were universally men of independent means, and their lack of idealism wasn't merely restricted to politics either. For the most part, these were men who looked at the world with a practical eye and were able to identify a problem, apply technique and technology to it, and solve it for a profit. They are the examples which we of the Sensible Centre must follow, as we have been blessed with the opportunity to usurp the current order as, for the first time in history, a ruling elite is making the conscious decision to walk back from an obviously superior form of energy for purely dogmatic reasons. Britain today is neither sensible nor a centred place. The regime has forgotten that the foundations of any technical society are built on energy. Our last coal mines are gone, oil and gas industries are a shadow of the former selves, and our nuclear industry has been sold out to foreigners. Worse still, our government seems to have put all our eggs into the renewables basket, hoping that wind and solar can save them. They won't. One of the few remaining uses of the British state is the UK Statistics Authority, who every year produce a handy booklet which provides a snapshot of the realm's energy ecosystem, and their latest one is for 2023. At a glance, the energy industry's contribution to the UK economy was 1.9% of gross value added, down from its 1982 peak of 10.4%. It directly employed 149,500 people and represented 24.6% of industrial investment and 6.9% of total investment. Employment in the energy production and supply industries fell rapidly through the 1980s and mid-1990s, largely a result of the closure of coal mines. This trend slowed somewhat between 1995 and the mid-2000s, but since 2006, it increased gradually, largely driven by the growth in the electricity and gas sectors. However, since 2020, employment in the energy industries has fallen back. In 2023, employment fell by 7.4% on the previous year to 149,500, which was 37% above its 2005 level and accounted for 5.3% of all industrial employment. Before we go on, when expressing very large amounts of energy, for some reports they use a derived unit called tons of oil equivalent, which equates to 11,630 kilowatt hours. For context, the average UK home will use about 12,000 kilowatt hours of gas and 2,900 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. Overall, domestic energy production has collapsed since 2000 from 288.7 million tonnes of oil equivalent to just 101.2 in 2023. Oil is down from 138.3 to 36.6, gas down from 108.4 to 32.9, coal down from 19.6 to just 0.4, and even electricity, despite the trillions of pounds thrown at it, has actually decreased from 20.2 to 17.5. The only growth area has been bioenergy and waste, with a modest increase from 2.3 to 13.7. Curiously, total energy consumption has also fallen since 2000, from 234.8 to 163.8, driven largely by a collapse in the use of coal, a reduction in the use of oil, and a continuing trend of deindustrialization. Industrial usage having fallen from 35.5 to 20.4. This means that in the last 25 years, we've gone from a net exporter to a net importer of energy. We had previously been importers until 1981, when development of the oil and gas industries tipped the balance back into the black. This was hindered by the Piper Alpha disaster, but resumed in the early 1990s. This reversed again in 2004 and has only got worse since. Imports of petroleum products have increased following the closure of the Croydon refinery in 2013, but we did briefly export electricity to France in 2022 due to problems with their nuclear generation capacity. Overall, we've gone from exporting 17% of our total energy generation to now importing 41%. Coal production has gone from 31.2 million tonnes and 23.4 million tonnes of imports in 2000 to a mere 500,000 tonnes produced and 3.5 million tonnes imported in 2023. Crude oil netted £4.9 billion worth of exports in the year 2000, down to £21.1 billion of imports in 2023. Electricity is no better. Looking at the numbers by generating method, from 2000 to 2023, all values here being in terawatt hours. Coal is down from 120 to 3.8. Oil and pump storage down from 13.6 to 10.8. Gas from 148.1 to 101.7. Nuclear is down from 85.1 to 40.6. Hydro is actually up slightly from 5.1 to 5.5. Wind and solar up from 0.9 to 96.2. And all others up from 4.3 to 34.1. However, total electricity generation is down from 377.1 to 292.7. Interestingly, nominal generating capacity has increased from 77.9 to 105.7 gigawatts, the amount of power we're able to put onto the grid simultaneously. Doing the maths, with 1 gigawatt supplied for 1 year, delivering 8.76 terawatt hours, the theoretical maximum output of the country's generators should have gone up from 682.4 to 919.8 terawatt hours. On a smaller scale, the one that we'd be looking to work on, solar is currently the dominant technology, both by growth rate and capacity. Here, numbers are only available back to 2010, but still illustrate the speed of development, all values here being in megawatt hours. Micro combined heat and power is up from 6 to 532. Anaerobic digestion is up from 1 to 6. Hydro is up from 12 to 237. Wind is up from 20 to 704. And solar is up from 86 to 6,492. But again, the nominal capacity installed for wind and solar are not actually materializing into energy production. So-called bioenergy accounted for 48% of the renewable electricity actually used in 2023, with waste accounting for a further 15%. All this means that prices have absolutely spiraled. The report indexes prices at 2010 levels, and in 2000 they were 52.6 for industry and 60.5 for domestic users. As of 2023, prices are 229.9 for industry and 196.9 for domestic users. So if you're wondering why you've changed all your electric bulbs from 100 watt incandescent to 3 watt LEDs, and your bills are still going up. That's why. As for Great British Energy, the founding statement opens with, and I quote, "Our country faces huge challenges. More than 2 years on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, families and businesses continue to pay the price for Britain's energy insecurity. Bills remain hundreds of pounds higher than before the energy crisis began and are expected to rise again soon. At the same time, we are confronted by the climate crisis all around us, not a future threat, but a present reality. And there is an unmet demand for good jobs and economic opportunities all across Britain." There's also this gem from the chairman, and I quote, "If we can combine the power of the private sector and government, we can accelerate the clean energy transition, and we can deliver stronger energy security, lower emissions, and a boom in good green jobs for the country." But after 14 pages of this lofty language and casual assertions, there's precious little actual progress. My guess is that this is going to be another HS2 with lots of press releases and bad CGI, but nothing more than a flower bed actually dug. The final paragraph states that, and I quote, "Throughout the next few months, we will be making the important steps to put Great British Energy on a delivery footing, including announcing the location in Scotland of its headquarters, starting to recruit key roles into the organisation, and undertaking a programme of stakeholder engagement to further develop our policy approach." After all this, it becomes clear that the problem is really in two parts. Part one, that the regime has neither the capacity nor the competency to achieve its techno-digital utopia. And part two, that we are stuck in the endless conversation, exactly where they want us. Taking these problems in turn. 1. The open and stated goal of our elites is the total unification of global systems through the imposition of global regulation. No borders, no people, no uniqueness, complete atomization and standardization, that is, the liberal individual. The necessary management of such a system has now become so mind-bendingly complex that their last throw of the dice is to keep saying AI enough times that it does something. I believe this is the true purpose of the green agenda, not to save the planet, although that's the most effective way of bringing women on side, but to electrify everything and make it smart, in quotes, by which, of course, they mean monitored. If something is monitored, it can be measured. If it can be measured, it can be optimized. And if it can be optimized, that optimization must be managed. This gets the autistic men on side. This is why how much milk is in your fridge and when you turn the dishwasher on are now matters of national and indeed international importance. A sensible tyranny, aka one run by an engineer, would have spent the last 40 years building a nuclear industry to provide cheap, abundant, and above all reliable electricity to underpin all this technology. But we're not in a sensible tyranny. We're in a very silly one. One might even call it fake and or gay, run by merchants and PPE students who don't have the first clue how any of the technology they're imposing on us actually works. As a result, I believe what started out as a student's aversion to nuclear power because CND banned the bomb Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, etc., has actively killed the only power that could have sustained them. We've gone from not wanting to build nuclear power stations to not being able to. Instead, our elites have gone for solar and wind as their saviours. This is very silly. Not only are these the most immediately intermittent sources of electricity, but are probably the two least inefficient forms of renewable energy possible. Oft repeated claim that they are cheap comes from the way electricity is bought and sold, not from the inherent abilities of our systems. Anyone with even half a functioning brain can see that the output is utterly unpredictable and uncontrollable. At least with hydro, you can control the flow of water through the turbine for a while, and tidal, whilst intermittent, is so predictable that it can be modelled with total accuracy for centuries hence. There is no reserve of input with either wind or solar. They're either making an amount of electricity or they're not, regardless of what the demand is. It might be the absolutely optimum weather conditions for wind turbines, but if it's 2 a.m., there's nobody there who needs the electricity. And this is where all those smart devices comes from. So the national grid can switch everybody's washing machines on, or indeed off, whenever there's a gust of wind in Scotland or the North Sea. As I've said, our administrators are not engineers, so when questioned, the technocrat will reply, yes, but storage technologies. When pushed, they'll glaze over and shout batteries, and when you rightly chastise them for this folly, they screw their faces up and walk away. This is actually something I've experienced personally. Unfortunately, it's not just the technocrats who are so afflicted. Back in February and March last year, I took part in the Cornwall Residents Energy Panel, and when confronted with the failures of a couple of pilot geothermal projects in the Duchy, one member of the great British public responded with, "Can't you just make the rocks hotter?" When I half chuckled back the reply, "You can't fight the laws of physics," all I got back was, "But surely, with modern technology." And this, my friends, sheds light on the crucial existential weakness of this regime. They really are a non-technical elite trying to govern a technical society. I have seen nothing to suggest that they do not hold the same views as the old boy from the panel, that technology, TM, which to them is a sort of white plastic box with blinky lights that makes a sort of shoom noise, will forever get 10% per annum better because progress. Actually, let's be reasonable. Technical progress, like inflation, should obviously be at 2% per annum, because I did international relations at Cambridge, then a doctorate in Middle Eastern literature at Harvard. I am very smart. So there is a growing fissure opening up between the aspirations of the elites, the physical limitations of their chosen technologies, that which legislation will permit, and their technical competence. Take cars as an example, that they want to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2030. They want for electric cars to have largely replaced them in the market by then, as many of the journeys will be undertaken by public transport. But there's not enough lithium on Earth for all the batteries. You can't get the weekly shop on a bus, and there's no way the country one would ever have even finished the initial planning stages for all the additional generating capacity and distribution infrastructure. You might hope this would lead to a situation like Cuba, where you'll all just keep our cars going, but there's no way to keep a Nissan Qashqai or a BMW 318 or even my beloved Mark III MX-5 going with bits from B&Q and hammers and shouting. The oil companies, meanwhile, have seen this as an excuse to stop the expensive business of R&D and exploration to pay themselves as much in dividends before the music stops. Clearly, therefore, there is a growing gap between the ambitions of policymakers and the absolute limitations of chosen technologies. It's clear that the opportunities for non-electrical energy sources have been largely neglected, but still represent the majority of total energy consumption. The hard truth of the matter is that there is not the resources, expertise, infrastructure, or capacity to do everything they want to do in the time they've given themselves. This is the fracture into which we must drive our wedge by supplying, some might say arbitrating, forms of energy that the mainstream have forgotten about. By talking the language of sustainability, but using long matured technologies to deliver localized, decentralized, and reliable forms of energy, we can use their own incompetence and hubris against them to push the current structures over. At this point, may I present to you the complete energy vision? My attempt to build a system by which we can build ourselves a strong foundation within the current system which can endure its collapse. Across the top, we see all the potential sources of our cooperative wealth. The first is woody biomass, which can either be products of forestry work, the waste from sawmills, the waste of wood collected from recycling centres. Next is a whole family of streams that I've put under green biomass, starting with alga culture. This is a fascinating and diverse field of research that has yet to really be exploited in this country. The name covers everything to do with the cultivation of algae and seaweed. Algae can either be grown in open ponds or in clear pipes, or even extracted from watercourses that have been affected by agricultural runoff. Their prolific growth rate have made them the field of study for decades and will periodically be the subject of clickbaity YouTube videos from mainstream channels. The next two are farming residues and slurry, which are fairly self-explanatory. One of the regime's favourite punching bags is the meat production and the methane emissions from it. If we can use these resources rather than let them go to waste, we may be able to save two things with one technology, that is meat eating and Western civilization. Green garden waste is something that we in this country will sit in queues for hours every bank holiday just to throw away at the council recycling centre. It's everything from grass clippings and hedge trimmings to those tomatoes that died because you kept forgetting to water them. It's linked to the final category, which is food waste, which can either be cooked or uncooked. Every year, millions of tonnes of this material is thrown away, and it's getting increasingly difficult for councils to deal with. Wouldn't it be nice if we were able to take the burden off their hands? Next are forms of electricity that do not come from other processes in the vision. Nuclear power is obviously the solution for the low carbon energy question. And I'm not suggesting at this stage that we start a co-fi to build a small modular reactor, but it should remain firmly in our field of interest. Microgeneration, however, can be something friends pursue right now, with my favourites being micro-hydro stations such as the twin generating stations at Mary Tavia, Morwell Ham in West Devon. These were built in the 1930s and have worked ever since, supplying electricity to their surrounding towns and villages, and are rated at 2,622 kilowatts and 700 kilowatts respectively. Morwell Ham Power Station actually uses the old Tavistock Canal as its leat, which was completed in 1817 to transport assayed copper ore from Tavistock to the Tamar River at Morwell Ham. The canal was built with a prevailing gradient of 1 foot in every mile, so the loaded tugboats would simply go with the flow through the 2,540-yard Morwell Down tunnel, which pops out 237 feet above the river. This is what the power station then uses as its head for its turbines. The tubs back then would then be winched down an incline railway by a water wheel, one of no less than 19 which used the canal, the last of which only stopped working in 1930, the year the power station was built. Our final source is oils, cooking oils, and greases. Where there's slop, there's brass. Vegetable oil was actually considered by Dr. Rudolf Diesel as a fuel for his engine, but he eventually settled on a heavier fraction of petroleum spirit because it was viewed as little more than a waste product at that time. Next, in the center, we see all the processes of the vision, and it is here that we can mix and match well-established processes in novel ways to create revenue streams. First of these processes is called pyrolysis and is simply the heating of things in an airless container. The heat leads to thermal decomposition, and the lack of oxygen means that it doesn't simply burn off and produce gases, but you can instead produce gases, liquids, and solids. If you put coal in the retort, you get town gas, coke, and pretty much the entire modern chemicals industry. If you put biomass in, you get gases, various interesting liquids, and charcoal. Charcoal is actually something of a wonder material. Not only can it be used as a fuel, either as lumps or as briquettes, but it is also the basis for many advanced filtration systems due to its incredible surface to area to volume ratio. It's also an absolutely stable form of carbon, so stable it's used to date charred grains of rice from the beginnings of agriculture, and as such could be used to solve the regime's carbon capture ambitions. The idea would be to set up a charcoal works next to one of those disused quarries in Wales and charge gullible celebrities and government ministries by the ton to make the charcoal and then chuck it in the big hole. Alternatively, charcoal fines can be activated, turned into biochar by soaking it in the nutrient-rich liquors which come from the next process, anaerobic digestion. This biochar can then be sold as a soil enhancement and a carbon sink, solving one of Jeremy Clarkson's biggest worries, that of soil longevity. Anaerobic digestion, as the name suggests, is the decomposition of biomass, again without oxygen, but this time by bacteria to produce a roughly 40-60 blend of carbon dioxide and methane. Methane is mostly what's in the national gas grid, so it can be used instead of natural gas. The carbon dioxide can either be sold as the basis for many chemical processes, as the fizz in fizzy drinks, or to be fed into our next set of processes, which are all to do with synthetic fuels. Very basically, synthetic fuels can be made by reversing the combustion processes using large quantities of energy, heat, pressure, and a catalyst. This is technology that the likes of Porsche and Audi are seriously looking into to secure the existence of their cars well into the future and could easily be sold back to the public as ways of keeping their cars running without harming the planet. There are older processes for making synthetic fuels, particularly the Bergius and Fischer-Tropsch processes, which were very popular with the Germans for some reason in the late 30s to the mid 40s, for a number of reasons to do with their inability to import sufficient fuel to meet their demands. In the Bergius process, carbon dioxide, or carbon, is mixed with hydrogen gas and a catalyst at 400 to 500 degrees C and 2,900 up to 10,000 psi to produce heavy oils, middle oils, spirits, and gases. After the war, the US began research into the conversion of coal into liquid fuels, and a plant was built at the rather confusingly named Louisiana in Missouri, which began operation in 1946 and was producing in commercial quantities by 1948. It was producing a slightly superior product at a slightly higher price until it was shut down by the Eisenhower administration in 1953 after substantial lobbying efforts by the oil industry. The Fischer-Tropsch process, meanwhile, uses syngas, which is a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, over a catalyst at between 150 and 300 degrees C, over a range of pressures and from a couple of hundred psi, depending on the desired output, to produce synthetic fuels and lubricants. Again, the mid-century Germans were using coal as the carbon source for their efforts, but we could use the charcoal, or more intriguingly for us, we could use the methane and carbon dioxide from our anaerobic digestion plant through a process called dry reformation. The Germans produced some 25% of their automobile fuels using this method, and it is now used in various plants throughout the world, particularly in the petrostates, where they've in the past struggled to sell their natural gas. So we're looking at ways to convert it into liquid fuels. Our final process here is the transesterification, which is the process by which vegetable oils are converted into biodiesel by breaking down triglycerides into ethyl esters. The process was first identified in the 19th century and was established enough that Dr. Rudolf Diesel ran his engine at the 1900 Paris Exposition on peanut oil. After all these processes, we have at the bottom of the vision all the products that we could sell to people and businesses. First and simplest to supply are the solid fuels, briquettes of compressed charcoal for industrial, transport and domestic uses. Then there's carbon sequestration, soil enhancement and liquid fertilizers. Next are the liquids, the synthetic petrol, diesel, lubricating oils, as well as biofuels. Moving to gases, we've got methane, carbon dioxide and hydrogen. And finally, there's the possibility to sell electricity directly to the grid. At the beginning of the 19th century, the continuing pressures of the Napoleonic Wars had driven the price of horses and fodder to historic highs. A series of bad harvests in 1810, 11, and 12 had pushed up food prices, and in 1815, Parliament introduced the now infamous Corn Laws, which prohibited the importation of grain until the price had exceeded 80 shillings a quarter, 10 shillings a bushel, which is about £2,120 in 2024. During this period, however, a group of friends up in the northeast were quietly working on a way to bring new forms of power to the transport of coal from their mines to the sea. The mixture of punitive government regulation, market fluctuations, and a deliberately imposed shortage had risen the cost of existing forms of energy to such an extent that new ones could for the first time become viable alternatives. Matthew Murray built the first commercially successful steam locomotive, Salamanca, for the Middleton Railway near Leeds in 1812. The railway was the first in the world to be given an Act of Parliament back in 1756, and it still runs today as a heritage line. The engine actually ran on a rack and pinion arrangement instead of driving its wheels, and was successful enough that another engine was built to this pattern at the Kenton and Coxlodge Colliery and Wagonway near Newcastle. In 1813, William Hedley built the Puffing Billy, the world's oldest surviving railway locomotive, for the Wylam Colliery, again near Newcastle, which was the first engine to prove that adhesion between the wheels and rails were sufficient to pull useful loads. His partners in this travelling engine, as they called it, were Jonathan Foster and Timothy Hackworth, under the watchful eye of the mine owner Christopher Blackett, who had bought an engine from Richard Trevithick back in 1804, owned the Globe newspaper of London, and whose son became a Tory MP, first for the rotten borough of Beer Alston, and then for Northumberland South. In 1814, George Stephenson, who was born in Wylam, then took the cylinder arrangement of the Murray engines and the adhesive drive of Hedley's to build his first locomotive, Blücher, or Blorcher, or some other variation on that. There is a debate. And put her to work at Killingworth. He continued to improve the fundamentals of the design until 1825, when locomotion number 1 pulled the opening train on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, where Timothy Hackworth was appointed locomotive superintendent on Stephenson's recommendations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pennines, a meeting between two prominent businessmen, William James and Joseph Sanders, in 1821, kicked off the first preliminary survey, called an ocular survey at the time, of what was to become the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Sanders was a prominent Liverpool businessman and a passionate advocate of parliamentary reform, and a member of the Society of Friends, who would go on to form a committee of prominent and well-connected men, including John Gladstone MP, father of the later Prime Minister, Charles Taylor, who would go on to found the Vulcan Foundry, and Robert Stephenson, Majors Hugh and Joseph Burley, of the Manchester Yeomanry, who had actually been present at the Peterloo Massacre, and John Kennedy, who was a personal friend of James Watt. At the now legendary locomotive trials at Rainhill, the winning engine Rocket was built by a consortium of George Stephenson, the line's chief engineer, his son Robert, and Henry Booth, who just so happened to be the company secretary and treasurer. What's intriguing, though, beyond this light bit of insider trading, is that all these men were dissenters, as were many members of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway Board. Indeed, Rocket was an early product of Robert Stephenson and Company of Newcastle, which had been set up after receiving financial backing from another prominent dissenter, the Quaker Edward Pease. After the success at Rainhill and the subsequent success of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, railway mania and rapid industrialisation led to the creation of wealth beyond the imagination of anyone during those hungry days of the Napoleonic Wars. Liverpool and Manchester Railway shares were initially valued at £100 each, and after the commencement of operations in 1830, the share price hovered between 173 and £295, and before absorption into the London and North Western Railway in 1846, the average dividend was no less than £9 10 shillings a share. Why am I telling you this story? Is it because I want to show you, dear friends, that such revolutionary change is possible without revolutionary action? As Dr. Parvini has long said, culture is downstream from law, and this is quite true, except it's not the complete analysis. Culture is downstream from law, but law is downstream from power, which is ultimately downstream from wealth. Wealth provides a man with the spare time and money to pursue his political ambition, to organise resources, support his friends, chastise his enemies, and if need be, purchase the loyalty of apparatchiks. We have had in the past few weeks, bearing in mind this was delivered back in August, a realisation that engaging in the political process is pointless, and that is quite correct. But it is not a turning away so as to become a hermit. It is to employ our precious time and labour to more constructive pursuits. The current power structure wants us to sit on Twitter endlessly quoting crime stats at Guardian journalists and berating leftists for their ignorance of basic economics. Throwing balls at each other in the baseball pit is very fun, but it's also a complete waste of time and energy. So is direct political campaigning. Protest will only put you on a watch list, and grassroots activism ultimately goes nowhere. The regime gets to survive for another cycle. What they don't want us to do is to get up and leave the ball pit, but that's exactly what we must do. They're trying to build an all-electric, technocratic, liberal utopia on the basis of generation technology that simply does not work. As a result, their paradigm is doomed to failure. What can be seen is that there are any number of ways to produce energy from locally available sources with a full spectrum of technologies, ranging from the cutting edge to the positively Victorian. There are 39 historic counties in England. If a friend had control of one local energy producer in each of them, that's the beginnings of quite the network of independent wealth and support nationally. Friends in control of their town's gas supply or able to provide home heating oil to pensioners are going to be far more able to influence their communities as respected and highly esteemed members thereof, rather than as spiteful internet trolls. To that end, I would like to propose the formation of a new cooperative of friends, an organisation with membership by subscription to raise the capital necessary to fund such revenue-earning projects and to provide a forum to share ideas, proposals and advice. The cooperative would strictly be non-political, inasmuch as that it would not be used to fund political projects directly, but would only admit members who are proven friends. We could use the funds raised to purchase sensible dividend-earning shares, purchase land to prevent development, and offer the produce of the land to friends at reduced prices or even gratis. We can come together to vertically integrate processes, share knowledge, and support other friends' projects with investment and support. In short, we must become like the dissenters of old and band together to support each other's endeavours. We've done tremendous work in our circles, amassing great knowledge, skills, vision, and passion. But now is the time to move from content creation to wealth creation and asset accumulation. Whilst I would never diminish the fine work of the Lotus Eaters or the academic agency, imagine what we could achieve if support was given to the creation of a stocks or land portfolio. At the time of writing, back in early August last year, National Grid shares were yielding 5.67%. So £100,000 of shares would be earning £5,670 per annum. if £100,000 could be raised each year by only 833 friends paying £10 a month in subscriptions. Alternatively, that same £100,000 could be used to buy between 10 and 20 acres of Devon woodland, generating about 1 tonne of dry wood per acre per year. As the old regime crumbles into quicksand of printed money and virtual reality, we will be at the forefront of the transition back to the sensible, real foundations of prosperity, those being property and sound energy. Their increasingly impotent attacks will fall on deaf ears until eventually we will finally be able to buy our way in and simply walk into the halls of power. In the coming dark times, he who can keep the lights on shall be king. So there we are. That was a speech I delivered to the Witan back in August last year. I'd love to know what you thought about it in the comment section. Apologies for chewing on my teeth and coughing during the reading. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you can at Alex That Steam Guy. I will be infinitely grateful. And if you really like the work, you can follow what I do on my Ko-Fi and Patreon, the links to which will be in the description. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.